disclaimer before we start this video, I would like to remind everyone watching that I am not a chemist and I am not a physicist. And the title of this chapter is The Chemical Basis of Life. And while the topics we will be discussing, I can easily go into much more depth with, that is not relevant for the purposes of a very general, very intro level biology talk. All right, with that out of the way, please enjoy the following few minutes. Hello and welcome back to Biology for Beginners. As always, I am your host, Morgan. Today we're talking about bonds, chemical bonds. Now, the first thing you need to know about chemical bonds is that electrons are the key to the entire process. Now, electrons are going to be located in what is known as electron shells, which kind of means that they're layered like an onion, and each of these shells has different orbitals, and an orbital is basically a place for electrons to exist, kind of like an apartment within the shell, and each orbital is able to hold 2 electrons. Now, the orbitals do have very specific shapes and properties that we're not going to talk about at all, because they're not necessarily relevant for our discussion, and we just don't need to go that in depth into the electron shells and orbitals. But the thing that you do need to know is that the very outer shell of the electron shells is the valence shell, and this is the shell that determines the properties of an atom. Now, atoms with a full valence shell are considered inert in that they don't readily bond or interact with other atoms. And usually a full valence shell is going to be 8 electrons. However, the elements that have only one shell of electrons, hydrogen and helium, the valence shell is considered full at 2 electrons because that is all they have room for, which is a little bit easier to see if you look at their proton count as well. Hydrogen only has 1 proton, and if you want to be neutral, which is generally the goal of nature, you can only have 1 electron. So hydrogen at neutral, 1 proton, 1 electron. Helium, however, has 2 protons. So to be neutral, you have 2 electrons. But that first valence shell only has 1 orbital, so it can only have 2 electrons, which means, looking at our examples here, helium and neon are what is known as noble gases. They don't readily interact with any other atoms or any other elements because both of them have a completely full outer shell. Whereas the elements here like chlorine and sodium still have room to interact and get that full outer valence. Now, chemical bonds are an attraction between 2 atoms resulting in the sharing of outer shell electrons or the presence of opposite charges on the atoms. The bonded atoms then gain complete outer electron shells. Now, the type of compounds that are formed entirely depends on the kind of bond that is formed, and we will go into more detail here in a few seconds. But right here, I just want to highlight the 3 examples that I am showing, where we have the H2O, the CH4, and the sodium chloride. Notice here that the sodium chloride has positive and negative charges. Now, this is because they have essentially one atom has given up an electron, resulting in the positive charge, and the other one has then accepted that electron, resulting in the negative charge, where the other 2 examples are sharing their electrons. But we're about to get more into both of those phenomena in just a moment. The first kind of bond we're going to dive into with a little more depth is the ionic bonds. Now, an ionic bond is a chemical bond resulting from the transfer of electrons and the attraction of oppositely charged ions. Now, an ion is a charged atom, and the way these occur is because one atom has given up an electron and one atom has then received that electron. Of course, it's not quite as simple as just one-to-one. Sometimes an atom will give up two, so on. However, it's very rare to see anything higher than a 3 charge, because generally when you get to 4, you're going to get 2 sharing. But that is all coming up in future slides, so just hold on before we get into that. Specifically with ions, the positively charged ion is going to be known as a cation, and the negatively charged ion is known as the anion. And the result of this ionic bonding is what is known as a salt. So it's easy to remember this because table salt, NaCl, sodium chloride, is an ionic bond. And the cool thing about this bond is that it's easy to break down in water, where you'll get these charged particles kind of floating around, but the overall solution will still be neutral because you still have that balance of an equal number of positive and an equal number of negative charges. But if you dry them out, the bond is very strong and it forms crystals. However, ionic bonds are considered just a moderate bond because of that whole dissolving thing that they do. Now, moving on from ionic bonds, where there's some sort of stealing of electrons going on, we're going to look at the covalent bonds, which is a chemical bond where the atoms share the electrons. And the most common example of this presented to any sort of intro-level science class is water. Water is a molecule formed with a single oxygen atom and 2 hydrogen atoms. And the oxygen is sharing electrons with those 2 hydrogen atoms, resulting in a very strong bond between the atoms present in the molecule. Now, a molecule is the result of the covalent bond. And sometimes you'll get bonds that have a partial charge on them. And this happens because the more electronegative atom more strongly attracts the electrons, like in the case of water. Oxygen is more electronegative than hydrogen, so the electrons that it's sharing with those hydrogen atoms are going to hang out by the oxygen more often than they hang out by the hydrogen, which results in the polar molecule. So you get a partial negative charge on oxygen with the partial positive charges on those hydrogens. Now, it's not the same as an ion because it is still sharing those electrons. There has been no removal of electrons at all in this entire process. But polar molecules can then be contrasted with what is known as a nonpolar molecule. And it's just an equal sharing of electrons. These electrons don't hang out at one atom more than the other, resulting in no partial charges. The overall molecule is completely neutral. Now, of course, polar molecules are neutral. They are not charged. It's just that if you look at just that single molecule, you'll notice that one side is a little more negative than the other, but it's still overall neutral. Now, the last bond we're going to look at today is known as a hydrogen bond. Hydrogen bonds are interesting because they're a very weak chemical bond that forms between the very weakly positive hydrogen in a polar covalent bond and the weakly negative atom in another polar covalent bond. Now, these bonds are very important in keeping the shape of proteins, holding together strands of DNA, and helping to translate that information from the DNA. but they are most easily represented when you look at water, because water likes to kind of stick to itself, which is done because these slightly negative oxygens interact with the slightly positive hydrogens in the other molecules. But what exactly happens when you start making and breaking all these chemical bonds? Well, you get what is known as a chemical reaction, and these are represented by equations, but instead of an equal sign, you get these arrows in the middle. One side you get your starting materials or your reactants, the other side you have your products, or what you end up with. And the important thing to note here is that you're always going to have the same amount of reactants as products. So looking at the two equations that I have chosen to use as examples, we get the 2H2 plus 2O2 that react to form 2H2O. Now, reactions like this cannot occur inside a living thing, but water is a very common product in other important reactions in life that we will discuss later. It's just important to note here that you have at the product end a total of 4 hydrogen atoms and 2 oxygen atoms. And if you look back at the reactants, you also have 4 hydrogen atoms and 2 oxygen atoms. And the reason why we're not just reacting 2 H's with 1 O is because in nature, hydrogen and oxygen are gases that would never just be seen as 1 H and 1 O. On their own, they are a nonpolar covalent molecule in the form of H2 or O2. So 2 hydrogen atoms bonded together and 2 oxygen atoms bonded together. And when they react, those bonds are broken and new bonds are formed, which makes the 2H2O at the end of the arrow here. If we look down, this equation might seem a little scarier, the 6CO2 plus 6H2O forming C6H12O6 and 6O2. But let's back up for a second. That's photosynthesis. And we will get more into photosynthesis in later videos. But the important thing I would like to highlight here is not the scary looking numbers and letters. It's that the arrow here is representing a bunch of steps that it takes to get from carbon dioxide and water to sugar and oxygen. Well, we have reached the end of our little chemical bond segment here. Again, I would like to emphasize that I am not a chemist, and I am only going as in-depth with this particular topic as the book that I am using is. Of course, I could easily ramble on about electrons and valence shells and orbitals for an entire video, but we don't need that for our purposes. All right, with that little thing out of the way, I do hope to see you guys next week for the properties of water and pH. I will see you all next time. Thank you again for watching this video. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and ring that bell if you would like to see more. And if you'd like to follow me on any of my other social medias, the links are down in the description below. Don't forget to check out thereptilegoth.com for all of my articles and blog posts. If you found any value in this video and you would like to help support the channel, please check out my Patreon page. That link is also in the description down below. And a special thanks goes out to my Diamond Dragon patron, Diane V. What you're doing is really helping me fund a dream here. I will see you guys all in the next one.